today we're gonna do something we haven't done in a while, which is we're gonna react to a Jesse video because I always have an open ear. You guys know this. I always have an open ear for Cyverse hate, right? Like whenever someone drops some hate on Cyverse, you know, I haven't seen the video yet. I already left the comment of let the Cyverse hate flow through you. I want to know what Jesse has to say about this current meta, because the video is titled New Year, New Meta, Same Old Problems in Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is a statement that I do not wholeheartedly agree with. I do think overall Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been getting into a lot healthier space with the recent set releases and ban list updates. It's a lot better than it used to be in 2024, in my opinion. That does not mean I think it has no problems anymore. So we'll have to wait and see.
Let's talk about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Format. I know this is one of the favorite pastimes of content creators in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Space, is to and moan about how much they hate Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Is dead, yada 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 yada. And this was even more true than ever last year during the Year of Fire, where a lot of players and content creators, like myself, voiced their opinions of dismay and dislike of what was going on in Yu-Gi-Oh! But now we're in 2025. The Year of Fire is over. The ban list has made sure of that, as well as new product releases have edged out any sort of viability that the Fire decks had. We are firmly in a brand new metagame. And how do we feel right now? Is this format healthy? Is this where we want Yu-Gi-Oh! To be? Let's talk about it. So a few days ago, a Philadelphia...
I think...
Philadelphia regional happened that has 740 players. That is a lot of players, even for Philadelphia standards. They can sometimes hit the 10-round mark, which requires about 500 players, and that is impressive. That makes for a huge regional, but 740 is crazy. That's the makings of a small YCS in the America regions, larger than most YCS in the Latin America region. And this shows that people are enjoying Yu-Gi-Oh! As past regionals in the area have had lower attendance during the Fire formats, not hitting 10 rounds and sometimes looking kind of disgustingly low. And I've seen other creators like MBT echo that this format is finally healthy and it's good. But truthfully, I don't share this opinion. So I don't want to scream from the rooftops saying this format is terrible.
this tweet was sick. I love that tweet.
And I hate Yu-Gi-Oh! Because that's not true. I still love this game, as well as I don't think this format is terrible. However, I think this is almost like us reeling from the pure terribleness of what Fire is. This format still is not great, and there's one big culprit in this. Now, ironically, going into this format, I expected Ryzeal to be rather boring. Its play patterns are mostly linear, and the gameplay is not the most interesting. However, it brings you back to some core Yu-Gi-Oh! Making reads is important, playing for follow-up is important, playing the long game with resources is important. All those things matter with Ryzeal. Despite my initial kind of concerns with Ryzeal being a boring deck, it's turned out to not be, and I actually quite like this deck. I think
I definitely resonate with that sentiment about Ryzeal. It is something that when it was first released, I probably felt similarly about it, like to the point where like, oh, this is just another relatively simple to play deck and stuff like that. I think the reason why I've changed my mind, or the reason why I've or what the conclusion I've reached when thinking about it more, is that Ryzeal is not boring and Ryzeal is also not super simple. The thing about Ryzeal that is simpler than other Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks is its first turn combos, which if you really think about it, that's something that we've been asking for a long time. Like, hey, make these turn ones go a little like not as crazy and more down to earth. The real game with Ryzeal starts after you've made your board. For some other Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks, especially in 2024, the game is building your turn one board. And with Ryzeal, it's like, well, you have a lot of ways to get to a relatively simple end board in relatively few steps. And yes, it does play well into hand traps, but the game doesn't end when the Ryzeal field is established. The game begins once the player going second picks up the card for turn and then plays into that field, because playing into that field is actually possible. There's a lot of game to be played after the Ryzeal player has made their board. And I think that's a good thing for Yu-Gi-Oh overall, because it offers people an easier way to get into the game, because if you're gonna play one of those crazy combo decks as a new player, you're gonna like struggle and not even really assemble any sort of board. It's not something that happens with Ryzeal. You can pick up Ryzeal and play it decently well after looking into the cards for a little bit. But when it gets really interesting is like, how do you use your interactions perfectly, and so on and so forth. Like, it's actually a very interactive deck if you look past the first turn. Abyss Dweller is a toxic card. You guys are mentioning Abyss Dweller right now. However, the way I feel about Abyss Dweller in this current format is that I agree with you. Abyss Dweller is toxic. In this current format, though, it doesn't happen super often because there's not that many decks that straight up just die to Dweller. It's not like you can play against Maliss or other Ryzeal decks, even if it's Ryzeal with some Fiendsmith cards. Like, Dweller is a good card against that, but Dweller doesn't auto-win any of those games. It's not like a terrible player can just summon Dweller and win against everyone in this format. There's like very few decks that straight up like can't play under Dweller, and like meta relevant ones. Of course, some do 100%, and Dweller probably should be banned, but I wouldn't say that Dweller is like actively ruining this format right now. Yeah. That being said, I think the current format is fine. And I'm using the word fine maybe because I think one of the main reasons why I like the current format is because of, let's say, what we've been through in 2024. It's not a perfect format. It's also, maybe in the grand scheme of things, if you compare it to all other Yu-Gi-Oh formats in the past, maybe it's not even among like the really good ones, right? Maybe it's not insane and will go down in the history as one of the most fun retro formats or anything like that. But for me, it feels so much better than it used to be with Snake Eye, Yubel, and Tenpai, that like I just can't help but like it because of what we've done, like what we've had before it. And at the end of the day, I never expected Yu-Gi-Oh to basically recover from like Snake Eye, Yubel, and Tenpai formats in just like one snap, right? Like for like one set release, one ban list, and we're completely healed, quote unquote, right? Like the play patterns that have been established throughout 2024, I think it's going to take some time for the game to go back to a different state, or not even go back, but just like go in some sort of other, like take another direction, right? Like it's going to take some work in card design, in balancing, in ban list and stuff like that to make Yu-Gi-Oh go back to something that feels more interactive and less about just building the craziest board you can on turn one. And so the way I see this format right now is I see it as a step in the right direction. We're not there yet. I just want to make that clear. I don't think we're there yet. What we're experiencing right now is not peak Yu-Gi-Oh how it should be. There's still flaws in this format. And that's true. And I guess that is something we're going to talk about in today's in this video.
It's a lot of fun to play against, and if all I was playing were a bunch of Ryzeal variants and mirrors, I'd be content for a little bit. No, where my problem comes from in this format is with Maliss. See, now Maliss feels to me like Snake Eyes or any of the fire decks.
Yeah, I mean, it's not much of a surprise because I've seen the thumbnail, and I have echoed this. I've said this in the past, like when I looked at crossover breaker archetypes, I was like, hey, I'm not worried about Ryzeal at all, but this Maliss deck, when you're going second against it, it's rough.
From the past, it's a combo deck that is too strong when it goes first, and honestly, it's almost unlike Snake Eye, it's not that strong going second, and it leaves a couple big issues in the format. My biggest problem with this deck is when it goes first. When it goes first...
But is it like super oppressive? It isn't, but once again, I don't think a deck being oppressive is the only thing that can make it like annoying or bad for the game. And once again, I want to emphasize, the reason why I also don't feel as strongly about Maliss is because I do think also Maliss, in regards to a combo deck, right? is less problematic than something like Snake Eye or Yubel. I think the Maliss, even though it makes a very strong layered end board, it is not as strong as a Snake Eye end board. It is not as resilient to certain hand traps or board breakers, depending on which ones. You know, like sometimes it does feel like going second against Maliss, you can't really win the game, but it still is a step in the right direction, right? Like facing down a full Yubel board is still, that's a different level than facing down a Maliss board. So the way I look at Maliss is like, is this what I want combo decks to be like? Not really. I don't think we're quite there yet. I still think that deck is a little bit too powerful and too hard to stop unless you're drawing very, very specific answers to it, right? Like you have to draw very specific answers to Maliss or get very lucky. Like your Maliss opponent either has to like break, or like you have to get very lucky that one infinite impermanence saves you from getting just completely blown out the water. And if you do use any of those one impermanence or something like that, if they have one extender, it completely invalidates it, right? It's like if you imperm a Dormouse, if you imperm Dormouse or White Rabbit or whatever, and it works, and they don't have the trap card to dodge it, if they then link it off and summon like a Bestial, it feels like you haven't achieved anything. It feels like you've just thrown your infinite impermanence into the graveyard. You're now playing with 4 cards, and your opponent is going to have the exact same board. It's very much comparable to normal summon Snake Eye Ash, imperm, well, special Diabell Star, right? What are we asking? Combo decks to lose to one interaction going first? No, but we're asking basically, if I had to, if the way I would phrase it is I think Maliss is lacking realistic choke points, because let's look at the example I mentioned earlier where you imperm the Dormouse and they have an extender and it feels like the imperm didn't do anything. You can't really hold that imperm for a later point in the combo, because at some point Maliss is gonna, like, they're gonna very quickly, if you let them play, set some of their trap cards, which almost completely invalidates your imperm later, right? Like if your opponent sets one of the trap cards and knows how to play Maliss, they just don't have to play into your imperm at all anymore. Basically, the only thing that you're left with is holding imperm for something like Terahertz or something like that, if you really wanted to, right? But that's also very inconsequential. Like because Terahertz is a quick effect and does their thing on both turns, you're like negating half of one of their monsters' effects at the end of the combo where they've created like 7 cards or something, right? And so I think essentially the way you want it to be is for a deck to have a like way to be resilient to hand traps, but still feel like the hand trap achieves something, right? Or like any sort of interaction, really, because it's not only hand traps, it's also other kind of cards like board breakers, and it's like basically very common non-engine cards feel very inconsequential against Maliss, because once again, with the hand traps, you're kind of gambling and you're just hoping that they don't play at all, because if they do play, you're not winning. But if you don't play hand traps, instead you rely on your own engine or other non-engine pieces, the Maliss deck makes a board that you are not breaking, right? Like if you just don't interrupt them at all because that's too shaky or too gambly and they don't have a choke point, you're not beating that end board, right? You're not really beating that end board. And that can be frustrating to play against, especially going second.
It's one card combos, which we've discussed for the last year, how as a player base we want to stray away from. They're not enjoyable. Something Dormouse, activating Mouse.
I still have a hard time, like one card combos is a topic that is, I feel like, on the one hand very controversial. On the other hand, I don't feel like it's that controversial. I think if you narrow it down, like I do think one card combos are in some ways healthy for Yu-Gi-Oh, because they make decks consistent, and I do think consistency is good. But I do think we can all agree, or at least the majority of the people I've talked to, and the vibe I'm getting from my chat, is that like one card combos should have a limit to how much they do. I think whenever a deck exists that just wins the game off of the back of just resolving one card combos, and its end board just becomes very, very powerful because they just activated one card, that's a little bit too much. And I definitely still think Maliss falls into that category. Like Maliss falls into that category because their end board just isn't really beatable. Even if it is, I mean, the chance of you beating a Maliss deck going second with a normal Yu-Gi-Oh deck, if they resolved their combo, is like maybe like 5% higher than versus like Snake Eye or something. Which means it's a little bit of a better design than Snake Eye, but not that much better.
Underground White Rabbit, I don't love dealing with it, and uninterrupted, it is far more threatening than a Ryzeal one-card combo, as well as it's not met with a single choke point as easily, unless you stop literal first thing, which of course then makes it easier to extend past, much like Snake Eyes. And then the problems get further exacerbated when we look at the deck when it has an extender.
Are there any positives about Maliss? I think, once again, this is subjective, because I can definitely see why playing Maliss is fun. Maliss seems like a fun deck to play. I do agree with that, right? Right now I'm talking from the perspective of someone who's preparing for a tournament, and at that point I think about, hey, what does Maliss do to the game as a whole in its existence? Like, because this doesn't really change even if I'm playing Maliss myself. If I'm playing Maliss myself, I'm still really scared of the mirror match. Why do you hate Maliss less than other decks? What's the difference? Because we are, once again, we're doing this thing where we're treating these decks like we're the same thing we talked about on Monday with that hexagon scheme thingy, where you look at stuff like this deck has grind game or it doesn't have grind game or whatever. Snake Eyes and Maliss, of course I'm simplifying when I say, like, when they go first and resolve their combo, they win, right? Like, the chance that a Snake Eye deck wins when it resolves its combo, or was in 2024, for the most part, it was like, I'd say like 90%, 95%. And most of the time, unironically, if your opponent started to combo with Snake Eyes and you looked at your hand, unless your hand was completely insane, you might as well just scoop it up. With Maliss, the odds that it wins going first are not like 90+%. There are scenarios where with really good hands, you can beat a Maliss board. It's not as, it doesn't feel as impossible as it does with Snake Eyes. And one example for this is actually a match I had against Maliss at the regional I played on Saturday, where I looked at my hand and it was a good hand. It was like Engraver, Talents, a Bestial, a Ryzeal normal summon, I think it was Bonfire, an Ash Blossom, and something like that, right? And so like I played against Maliss, I went second, I used my Ash Blossom, they had an extender, so it felt like the Ash Blossom did nothing, but I didn't feel like I had to immediately surrender, because like my hand was solid, right? And so I let him build their board. I drew my card for a turn. I tried to play into it. The problem is, like, I end up, even with a very good hand like that, it ended up feeling like I didn't even get close to winning, even though it was like worth a try. You know what I mean? If that hand happened against Yugioh, I'm not even watching their turn. I'm not bothering. I'm going game 2, right? So that's the difference. Even though against the Maliss player I still ended up losing, I felt like there was more of a game to be played. Like, I actually felt like, hey, it's worth it to try, because maybe if they mess up a little bit, then I have a chance of winning with a good hand. Which ended up not happening. I still ended up losing because they ended up also using their interruptions well. But against Yugioh, I'm literally sitting there and I'm like, there's not even like, there's no point. Like, they can't mess up that badly with a deck this broken that I even have a remote chance with my hand right now. So in my head, there is a slight difference between those two decks. Was that understandable? I'm trying to get this across because, yeah, it feels more beatable, even though I think if you look at the raw statistics, it's not really more beatable, maybe by a couple of percentages, which is why it is a step in the right direction. That's why I'm not feeling so negative about it as I do about Snake Eye and Yugioh. it is a step in the right direction. It's not the solution. It's not where I want combo decks to be. But it's much better, I think. It is much better. And that is also partially because of how Maliss works when it goes second. Maliss is not as good as at breaking boards as Yugioh was or Snake Eye. The Maliss deck, and that is something that is quite cool about it, because Maliss is mostly link 3s. The Maliss deck does have to put up like a bunch of bodies before it can do any meaningful things, which is something that most decks can prevent going first. Like cards that just like destroy a card on the field or banish a card on the field or set a card face down or something like that are pretty good against Maliss. Like those are things where you can actually let them cook a little bit and then pop 1 or 2 of their link materials, and then the deck actually struggles to push past that. The problem is when you go second, you don't have that sort of interaction. We don't have those sort of cards.
So say you have Hornet Drones, Engage, a Kestra Unicorn, or a Bestial. Essentially a way that generates 2 extra bodies, because then you get to go into cards like Haggard Lizardos or SP, and then build up into link 3s. And if you've played against Maliss, you'll know that having the second hand trap or the second extender doesn't do anything.
Yes.
It's like when you played against Fiendsmith Snake Eyes.
Yeah.
You could imperm the Witch after you impermed the Snake Eye Ash. Now you lose to the Fiendsmith cards.
That is a very, very, very problematic thing in combo decks, is when 2 cards beat 2 hand traps. That is something that is very, very unhealthy, I think, because that's the one where you either have 3 or 4 hand traps or you're not doing anything.
You needed the third hand trap or their second card, which can make going second feel impossible. You have to build your deck with an enormous amount of hand traps to win going second. And it favors almost going second in these formats, which is what I did in Snake Eye for a bit, because I built a deck with like 30 hand traps, like 12 engine cards. But it's frustrating because it leaves little agency to the player. There's not much decision making to be made. It's just not something that I enjoy. And these are rehashing the same arguments we've had in the last year. And that way Maliss feels like playing against Snake Eye Fiendsmith, which I'm sick of. And I'm sure you guys...
Even though I wouldn't put it as drastically, I do understand where he's coming from, and I don't think he's wrong. I feel about it a little bit more positive than against Snake Eye. I would not say Maliss feels like Snake Eye, but it has a lot of similarities that I don't appreciate.
Guys are as well. But I think it's honestly a bit worse than that as well, because Maliss is actually kind of shit. When it goes second, the deck is not very good at playing through disruption.
I'm gonna be honest with you. I agree with this. I don't see a reason to actually play Maliss, even though it's not shit. All right, it's a good deck. But when Ryzeal is in the format, I don't see an appeal to play Maliss, because like the deck is not good going second. There's cards like Lancia out there that completely destroy the Maliss engine and stuff like that. I don't see an appeal to playing Maliss. I don't understand why you would do that. Like, why would you play a deck that's dependent on the dice roll when there's other decks that don't, and so on and so forth. But that's a different topic.
It needs to bridge together 3 bodies in order to make something meaningful. So unlike Fiendsmith cards in the Snake Eye deck, or Flamebirch, which required a 2-body commitment, you need 3. And that means removal is way more effective versus this deck. And when it plays going second, Maliss has to rely on non-engine to make that distance up, where Snake Eye didn't often need to do that, especially for its rogue decks. However, with removal just not existing as a hand trap form, when you go second against Maliss, it may as well be Snake Eye. And
I just don't like the playstyle of Fiendsmith Ryzeal. That's fair. And when I say I don't understand it, it's because I'm looking at it through the lens of just competitively speaking, right? Like when I go to a tournament, I'm trying to pick the deck that gives me like good odds of performing well. I don't think Maliss offers you better percentages than Ryzeal, not because it's like an inherently worse deck, but because of like a lot of outside factors like dice rolls, like Lancias and stuff like that. Like just a lot of factors that you, no matter how good you are, you can't really control those factors. And so those are the kind of decks that I tend to stay away from if there's other options in the game, because that's what I value. In your case, if you're valuing, hey, I'm having more fun playing the Maliss deck because when I actually do get to do my combo, I think it's more fun than playing Ryzeal, that's fair enough. But then you're just valuing other things than what I'm valuing right now when I'm like preparing for a tournament. You know what I mean? It's not like you're not wrong. Well, like no one's wrong if they say I'm playing this deck because I enjoy it more, right? But like it just depends what you're trying to do or trying to achieve when you're entering a tournament.
This is overall kind of very frustrating because it feels like when I play versus Maliss, it's a lot of the time a coin flip.
It's also a valid pick. It's valid to pick another deck if you think you're not experienced enough to beat experienced player in the Fiendsmith Mirror. Yeah, funnily enough, the thing I just said about like, oh, the deck like being very dice roll reliant or reliant on getting Lancet or not getting Lancet, for some people that can also that might as well just be a positive, right? Like if you're not as experienced or you don't have time to practice or whatever like that, like playing those sort of decks that just win when they go first can be a help to you. And I don't mean that in any negative sort of way. They could give you better odds to perform if you hadn't had the time to really like get crazy good at a format, right? So like what is something that sometimes like it turns me off when I look at a deck and I don't want to play it because it's so dice roll dependent. To other people it could be an advantage because they'll be like, hey, at least half the time I'm gonna have an easier time with this deck. I'm not really prepared yet or whatever, right? So like that is it, once again, very subjective on how you like what you expect from the tournament, what you're trying to do, and what your position is.
Where I have no control over the match. And at first I thought, okay, historically Yu-Gi-Oh players have avoided these type of decks because they're not fun. And they're really not that good. But for some
I don't think this is true. I think this stems from a point that I very much resonate with, where they're not fun is not true entirely for these decks. This is something that Jesse experiences because these decks are frustrating for Jesse to play against. That's the part that's not fun. I guarantee you the plant player that I lost to at round 7 at my last regionals because they just rolled a higher number than me, I'm pretty sure they had fun while I was watching their movie in game 1 and game 3. I'm pretty sure they had a good time. You know what I mean? These sort of things are only true for one of the two players involved, right? And that's this is the thing that's hard to grasp, I suppose, or hard to find like a what's it called? It's hard to reach an agreement on whether this sort of stuff should exist or not, because when I'm saying I don't find it fun, what I mean is I don't like it when I'm playing against it. But arguably, the other person that is doing those things, that is playing through your hand traps like it's nothing, or makes a board and just you just pack up your stuff and leave because you can't beat their board, I'm sure they're having some sort of fun, and that's where I think that's where the debates should start. Is like, is it possible to have decks in the game that provide a fun experience for both players? Because I would say, on the one hand, I would say maybe it's unrealistic to say, hey, everything needs to be fun for both players, because hey, it's a two-player game. Someone is winning, someone's losing. The player losing by default is going to have less fun than the opponent, so maybe it's natural. On the other hand, I do feel like there are decks that even when you play against them, and even if you lose to them, you have more fun than others. Once again, this is subjective, but I don't have as much fun if I'm just getting comboed into the ground, I'm looking at my hand and I can't play a card, or it's not worth playing a card because they've got so many interruptions, and they've also played through like 1 or 2 of my hand traps or whatever. I don't think that's a very fun experience. There's other decks, like if I'm losing a game against, I'm going to use another popular deck at the moment. If I'm losing a game against Ryzeal, chances are that game was not decided because my opponent made a board and I just looked at my hand and packed it up. That has never happened for me when I played against Ryzeal. Every time I played against Ryzeal, it was worth to start playing, see how they're going to use their cards, see what kind of cards they maybe have left in hand, see if they have follow-up, those kind of things, right? Like, it was a more fun experience, even if it turned out they had a winning hand at the end of the day, or like they top decked follow-up and that's why they won, whatever. Like, I think it's possible to have decks that are more fun even for the player that's playing against it than these sort of decks. But like I said earlier, I do think Maliss is a little bit more fun to play against than Yugioh, for example, because like I said, the Maliss board, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the Maliss board makes me want to try and see if I can break it. The Yugioh board doesn't. The Yugioh board really didn't do that. You just looked at your hand, and almost no matter what your hand was, you would just pack it up and go next. Against Maliss, sometimes you want to try and see if it's possible, even though it turns out most of the time it's not.
Reason, at least in Toronto, there's a shit ton of Maliss, and I'm really not enjoying it. I just want to play against Ryzeal and other like fair decks. I love the Fiendsmith engine. I know it prices people out, and that's an entire other issue, but the Fiendsmith play patterns I enjoy. However, I'm playing against Maliss, and I'm just getting FTK'd essentially every game, and that's why I said I want to delete Cyverse. And yeah, I'm taking my hate out on Cyverse too much, because in reality, I love Salad. I don't love Salad, but I think Salad and Maliss like.
I want to clarify something. And I know it's not going to change much because it's already gotten so much of a meme. But I don't hate Cyverse for the sake of Cyverse. There's certain play patterns I don't like in Yu-Gi-Oh! And Cyverse just happens to have spawned a bunch of decks that have that play pattern. In reality, it's only really MathMech and all those decks that just abuse Link Decoder and Splash Mage, because those cards are just kind of designed to do that sort of thing where your board is much stronger than it should be, because you're turning 2 monsters into a Link 5 out for no reason or something like that, which is not that fun. But decks like Salamangreat and Maliss I actually quite enjoy playing against. Even I had a match against Salamangreat at my regionals. I think it was round 3. It was a super close match. I ended up winning 2-1, but all 3 games were really, really fun. Even the one I lost were fun games, and it was just all around enjoyable. So like I do think there's ways to design Yu-Gi-Oh decks that are strong going first, have even some longer combos, not crazy long, but like longer combos, and are still fun to play against. I just think we've reached a threshold in 2024 that is a little bit too crazy. And I think Maliss is a step down from Yugioh, but it's not enough for me personally.
Totally fine decks. The only real offenders are MathMech and Maliss, but God, these are very frustrating design. And MathMech is the same thing. If you play properly against MathMech cannot beat removal cards. So if you go first against MathMech with some removal, like an IP and an SP, they're gonna do nothing. They just can't do anything. And it feels like the same thing with Maliss. I mean, Maliss plays in specifically SP better because of the banish stuff, but it's not good. And that means I don't want to play Maliss, but I really don't want to play against it either. And when you're dreading playing against the deck because of how the play, patterns are, and not because of strictly a matchup, that's a bad thing. Now, my hope is that with
this is another thing that I don't know how many times people actually think about that sort of stuff, or this argument in particular. I'm not scared playing against Maliss because I think there's a high chance I'm gonna lose, or like statistically I don't think Maliss is a problem. I don't think Maliss wins more than it should, or more than any Yu-Gi-Oh deck should, or like its win percentages or whatever are crazy high. I don't think that's the reason why or that's not why I'm afraid of playing against it. It's just like it feels like you have less control over those games, because outside factors that are very, very like much down to just variance and nothing else is what decides those outcomes, right? It's like dice roll, huge factor with these decks, like almost traditionally at this point. Drawing the right hand traps, or drawing certain blowout cards like Nibiru, like Lancia, like Chaos Hunter, those kind of cards, I feel like those are big red flags for why these sort of decks aren't healthy, even if their overall win rate isn't that high. Maliss is not more successful than Ryzeal. No one is arguing that Maliss is the best deck in Yu-Gi-Oh overall, and that's why it's like a problem. It's more about its play and design patterns that I do think are problematic, even though I definitely see why the deck is fun to play yourself. But I don't think that's I don't think that's a justification like on its own. Like, hey, I'm having fun when I'm stomping my opponents with Maliss. Because at the end of the day, it's a two-player game, so it is hard to make both players happy when one player is losing and one player is winning. But you shouldn't just disregard 50% of the basically the two players, right? Like there should be a world where even the losing player has some fun, you know, is what I'm saying.
Supreme Darkness. Molch Army Nialis, or I'm sure it's a new TCG name, reflects Banish and Graveyards, will give us an extra card that combats Maliss going second, especially post side, to make it feel a little more comfortable. But right now, the only cards that deal with it are Lancia and Fubulas that give you any semblance of hope. Nibiru paired with some other stuff can get there, but it's still asterisk can, because depending on the extenders and the hand and the pilot, it still doesn't matter, just like Snake Eyes. So with Fubulas and Lancia, that's all we have. Because let's talk about Lancia. Lancia offers essentially no counterplay, where Fubulas at least gives some creative options. I can't imagine playing Maliss partially for the reason of getting Lancia 1 in every 3 games. That has to feel awful. And maybe it's okay 1 every 3 games post side, but going into a long tournament, that sounds abysmal. You have to deal with the deck's already a little under average consistency, to deal with its issues into removal going second. Now it's Lancia 1 every 3 games to go second as well. I just can't fathom this being a good deck to play. However, it's popular and it leads to a lot of non-matches, and you can watch the locals vlogs I've been playing. I built my Goblin deck for Ryzeal and I played like 5 Maliss in a 7-round tournament, and it led to a lot of games that are really not interesting. Either I went first and the deck didn't do well, so it still lost, or I went second, I hand trapped twice, did nothing, and I lost, while I Lancia'd them and they lost in 5 seconds. And this goes back to discussions I've made before, like what I hate about Yu-Gi-Oh!, talking about how much I hate Lingering Floodgates. Lancia is one of them. I talked about Lancia being one that should be banned back then, even though it was doing nothing in the format, because when a banished deck comes around, we have this problem. And again, it's just frustrating to play against as a Maliss player. If Maliss was more interactive all around, or if Lancia didn't exist, therefore making Maliss better, maybe there'd be better ways of going about it and the format could heal itself, but it overall ends up in a shape that I don't like. Maliss is just kind of the black swan, or what is it, the ugly duckling in the group that is unhealthy, where everything else feels like it's finally in a good place, and Yu-Gi-Oh is healing. So yeah, I hope that with another Molch Army, there's kind of 9 draws going second against Maliss that edge out this favorability, and I hope we're all in agreement that we will just F this stupid Maliss deck. I want to have this discussion because a lot of people are talking about how much Yu-Gi-Oh has improved, and while I don't want to sound like a complete Debbie Downer, I still think that Maliss is a problem. We have to let Konami know that this is not okay. It's something we don't want to see, because I'm done with them. I don't want to see more of these decks. Give me more Ryzeals. Let me know what you guys think, though.
Overall, I agree with the sentiment. I wouldn't put it as drastic. Like, I don't feel the same hatred for Maliss that I've experienced for something like Yubel, for example, in 2024. Maybe that's also just because the deck hasn't been around for that long. But I do agree that Ryzeal has some problematic play patterns. And even though I do understand it's a fun deck to play, I do think it's also important to put yourself in the position of, you know, the other player in that instance. And I do think you could do better in terms of card design and game design on decks that are also more fun to play against. Because Maliss, overall, grand scheme of things, it's not very fun to play against. It might be fun to play, but it's not that fun to play against. And that is because it has a lot of frustrating aspects to it that are very hard to control, and it just wins too much when it goes first. Like it is just one of those decks where if it resolves its combo, it usually wins the game, and that is something that we've been wanting to get away from. At least that's how I felt like the consensus was in the Yu-Gi-Oh community, is that we want boards to be slightly less oppressive in the game moving forward. But maybe also just I mean that's how I feel, at least. I don't want to speak for everyone, but that's how I feel. All right, you guys are saying new card, but I have been refreshing YG organization in the other tab, and I haven't seen it. I have not seen it. So as soon as it's ready, you guys can let me know. The comments are mad at Jesse, by the way. Why though? I mean, I don't know if this is going to be healthy if we go into the comments right now. People love Maliss. That's crazy. I have the exact opposite reaction. Ryzeal is easily one of the most miserable decks to play against that I've ever experienced. It's hard for me to respond to this because I genuinely don't understand where it's coming from. Like I think what I'm seeing here is for one side of the argument, we're getting like Jesse's making arguments as to why he doesn't like to play against Maliss. But anyone I've ever heard saying like I hate playing against Ryzeal, I don't see many arguments. Like people I've heard Ryzeal is boring, which I'm gonna be honest with you, I don't get it 100%. I don't really understand what people find boring about Ryzeal, because at the end of the day in Yu-Gi-Oh, most decks these days try to do a repetitive thing on when they go first. The advantage with Ryzeal is it doesn't take as long. Like, how can Ryzeal be less boring than Maliss? Both decks are doing a combo turn one that almost always tries to do the same things, end on the same things. The Ryzeal one is just faster. Why is that more boring? I don't. That's a genuine question, by the way. It's a genuine question that I was wondering about. Is like, why are people referring to Ryzeal as boring? Why is Ryzeal boring? Ryzeal has less steps than most other combo decks in Yu-Gi-Oh. From what I hear, it's the fact it's too linear. I don't agree with the argument, but yeah. I mean, the thing is, I don't know. Maybe it's because there's different people saying different things. But linearity, like a deck being linear in this case, I think is not inherently a bad thing, because what do they mean by linear? Because if you really think about it, all of those one card combo decks are linear. If you start with one Maliss card, let it be White Rabbit, let it be Maliss in Underground, let it be Maliss Dormouse, you're always gonna do the same thing. It is linear. And even if you add a second card to the mix, there is also one specific combo you're supposed to do with those cards that everyone is doing. If people open Dormouse plus Bestial or whatever, there is one line you're supposed to do. Right? You're not gonna like change up how you do that in one game and then do it completely differently in the next one to have some change up in it, you know, like not be as linear. That's not how it works. That is, in general, that is an inherent downside of one card combos, is that if one card leads into a string of plays, that combo line is always going to be the same because it's consisted of like guaranteed steps. If you start with Maliss Dormouse, you have guaranteed access to Maliss White Rabbit. Maliss White Rabbit gives you guaranteed access to one of your trap cards, which gives you guaranteed access to another Maliss card, which link summons a card that you have guaranteed access through in your extra deck, which then also searches you a guaranteed card. That's how one card combos work, and that always ends up being linear. It doesn't have anything to do with like with the deck that's doing it. Every deck that has one card combos, they're going to be linear because there's always going to be an optimal way to use your guaranteed options. So in this sense, I think in some ways Ryzeal is even less linear than Maliss, because both are doing one card combos that are like guaranteed, right? So you always reach the same result. Ryzeal reaches it faster though, and Ryzeal, the reason why I feel like it's less linear in terms of overall gameplay is because Ryzeal reaches its end board relatively fast, passes over to the opponent, and that's when the possible gameplay starts like diverging. That's when like there's a lot of different possibilities on what kind of hand your opponent has, how they play into your board, and where you use your pops and your maybe effect veiler or your Ryzeal plugin or your Ryzeal cross or your Fiendsmith trap card. That's where it starts becoming non-linear, is when the actual game starts, which is past turn one. The Maliss end board, most of the time, the game, it doesn't immediately end when you make it, but you've done like 90% of the work you need to do to win in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh is getting your Maliss board together. Like making that board is the game, the majority of the game. The part where your opponent struggles to play into your shit and you feel like super superior because you've put up so many interactions that your opponent really struggles to get anything together, and then they scoop like a minute later or 2 minutes later. That's not the major part of the work you're doing. It doesn't like, you know, in that sense, I don't agree that Maliss is less linear than Ryzeal, because you just have like a line based on your opening hand that gets you to your end board, and that end board wins you the game pretty much no matter how you use it. So I don't really, it's not something I can really get behind. For me, the end board of Maliss is more layered than Ryzeal, so I feel Maliss has more skill expression. I don't exactly understand where that's coming from, because layers in interruption says something about quality of your end board. It doesn't say anything about how hard it is to use those layers. Because at the end of the day, in Yu-Gi-Oh, what skill expression means is you're presented with a plethora of options, and skill expression means how much it matters how you navigate through those options. If you're being presented with you have a Maliss end board now, in front of you, and your opponent has used like an imperm to try and stop you to get there, hasn't been successful because your deck has extenders, and now your task is to win with that end board. Arguably, that is a lot easier than winning with a detonator. That is not the same. Layers just mean how hard it is for your opponent to actually do anything, right? So when we say a layered end board is a good thing, we mean like, hey, that's a high quality end board. And I would never argue that. The Maliss end board is very high quality, right? It's good in the sense that like it's hard to beat. But that doesn't mean like, oh, it's going to be so hard to use all these different layers correctly. Like, no, it just means if your opponent Dark Rulers you still have a lot of stuff left. Like, that's what layered means. Layered does not mean, oh, it's very complicated to use it. Like, at the end of the day, if I had 5 monsters next to each other that all had an Omni Negate, that wouldn't be considered very layered because one Dark Ruler takes it apart. But it doesn't say anything about the like how hard it would be to use the interactions that you've created. The thing is, there's also different things, because something that you're saying, Maliss interaction isn't just direct negation removal. It needs a good order to make use of all those interruptions. There are positives about Maliss, and that's why I don't feel as negative about it as I do about like, let's say Yubel, for example. Is because some of those interactions are actually pretty interesting, right? Like a banish from the graveyard, a banish from the field, whatever. Those kind of things are interesting things that you play into, and you're like, I wonder how my opponent is going to use that, so I can see if I can break it. Maliss has interactive pieces. The problem is that it's too much. If you reach critical mass of interesting interactions, it's still not breakable, right? Like if one Maliss card gives you like a triple banish from the graveyard, a 2 non-target banishes from the field, a spell trap negation, follow up like crazy, so you basically have to kill that deck, otherwise it's gonna do everything next turn again, all that sort of stuff. At that point, it's like, yeah, those individual things are interesting pieces that you could build an interesting deck out of, but it's just too many of those things, right? Like it's yeah. I don't know how to phrase it differently. Dragon Link is non-linear in the way that the cards do things, but once they go into the extra deck, it's always usually the same end board. The only deck I can think of that's actually non-linear is like Dark World. Yeah, that's a good point. Non-linear. I don't think it's even a good way to describe Yu-Gi-Oh decks, because at the end of the day, every sort of deck follows some sort of plan, and usually if a deck is consistent, it'll have like a couple of consistent ways to get to that thing, and they're all trying to be linear in that thing. Like, linear is something that every deck aspires to be. Every deck is trying to be linear, except for like super outlier examples like Dark World or anything like that. or decks that, like, basically decks that are inherently based around random aspects like milling, like Tearlaments. But even those decks, like even Tearlaments in a way tries to be linear, because the deck is only like really good in formats where it's so consistent. Like if you play against full power Ishizu tier, like, yeah, the way they get there is sometimes a little different, but the deck was so consistent and so powerful, and it had guaranteed aspects in it, right? Like your extra deck access was very consistent, because like what Tearlament name you're milling exactly is not relevant. You're always going to make the guaranteed kit close unless you get really unlucky. So it's not as linear as other decks, but it still has an aspect of like consistency to it, which ultimately makes it play. I mean, Ishizu tier game, like Ishizu Tearlament games will, after a while, they will start feeling repetitive and similar. That is something that that's just how it works. I don't know. It's hard to. I kind of get what you're saying with these examples, but I'm also not sure how much that really says about the quality of the deck for the game. I don't know. I think ultimately the question is that everyone needs to answer for themselves. There is no right or wrong answer to this, but should a game of Yu-Gi-Oh be decided by an end board, right? Which is basically the question of like, are you enjoying like the existence of these kind of like quote unquote hardcore combo decks in the game, right? And if you think that's something that should exist, then you're not going to have a problem with Maliss, because that's what it does. If you do think the real game of Yu-Gi-Oh should start, like the player going second should have a realistic chance of breaking a board and playing the game, even if they didn't disrupt the opponent or anything like that, then I think you should have an issue with Maliss, because Maliss does not really offer that.